So I had a chance to watch the press conference on the masjid shooting, and there was a part of it that, well, there were a lot of parts of it, honestly, that really made me sad. But there was one particular part that stood out, and it stood out because I think that it's a really big part of the problem. And if we want real solutions, if we really want to put an end to this, you can't operate in the way that we've been operating. You can't take the perspective that was taken, right? So I don't remember the elder's name, um, but he used a term to describe the people causing the violence that I don't think is appropriate. And again, I believe is a big part of the problem. He used the term miscreants. And I don't think it's fair to label children in that way. You know, for the most part, I think the majority of the people who were involved were kids. They were minors. There was one person over 21, and right, let's operate in the facts. Let's call things what they are. The human brain doesn't fully develop until 26. And spiritually, we don't come of age until 36. So, for all intents and purposes, I believe the one person whose picture is plastered all over the television um, is like 21 or 22. Legally an adult, right? Can buy alcohol, can go to war. But biologically, spiritually, a kid. And so, again, I don't think that term is appropriate, and I don't think it helps to solve the problem. I think that attitude, I think that perspective, I think that sentiment is exactly what creates your chaos in the first place. I think it's exactly what creates the type of person who would do that type of thing in the first place. And you can't solve a problem the same way you got there, right? It's pretty much the way I look at it, there's a dehumanizing aspect to that, right? That's a child, number one, that is another human being, right? When I look at that mugshot, I see my nephew, I see my brother, I see my neighbor, I see another human being. And I don't think that it makes sense to dehumanize another human being for wrongdoing, particularly human beings that aren't even fully developed. Like, at the end of the day, children do what they are taught, they do what they've been modeled. And so, when it's time to talk about this problem, right, we got to talk about how people are being raised. We got to talk about toxic family systems. And that's the thing that I feel as though we consistently avoid, which is why we still have the problem. We don't want to solve the problem at root cause. We want to dance on the top layer, right? No healthy, whole person wakes up and says, you know what? I'm going to go and shoot a bunch of people today. Yep, that's what I'll do. I'm going to go and take a bunch of lives. Said no healthy person ever. Said no well-watered person ever. Right? Shooters are created. And I'm speaking from what I've seen. I'm speaking from what I've watched. I got a nephew on the other side of the wall with a 20-year sentence for taking someone's life. His father, my brother, served a 10-year sentence for taking someone's life. And so, again, for all intents and purposes, there are people who make mistakes who we still love, and we should still love them. And so taking that perspective is not helpful, because at the end of the day, what got that person there? What got that person to a point where they woke up and said, yeah, this is what I'm going to go and do today? Right? There's a formula for creating a shooter like there is for anything else. You take certain variables and you add those variables together, and that's what you'll get. And so until we're ready to deal with all of the ingredients that goes into creating that type of person, we'll have the problem. Labeling a person is not going to do it. Right? And when I look at my family, when I look at my nephew, and I'm going to tell his story without his permission, so I got to apologize in advance, but I feel as though the end justifies the means. This is somebody who was abused their entire life, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Abusive mother, father absent, father in jail, grandmother on drugs, other grandmother narcissistic and emotionally, psychologically abusive. Where was the healthy coping mechanisms, problem solving tools, ability to move through conflict going to come from? Where was he getting that from? People do what they are modeled. And again, right? Whenever this comes up, I feel like it's the same cycle. Like, we want to talk about everything except what needs to be talked about. We don't want to talk about the fact that using violence as a teaching tool with our children is part of the problem. You beat a kid their entire life. You put your hands on a child for a decade. And then you wonder why they go out into the world and repeat that behavior. You question why they go out into the world and they use violence when they want to accomplish something, when they don't get their way, when they feel as though somebody has offended or harmed them. Well, That's what they were taught. That's what they were shown. That's all they know. And then some of us want to justify it, right? We want to justify it. We want to say that it comes from God, and that's what the Bible says, and it's necessary. And don't forget the, oh, well, I was beaten and I'm fine. Well, are you fine? We got to look at what fine actually means. What's fine in 2024? Because a lot of what we consider fine is not fine at all. And so the expectation that you can line a person up in a certain way and the outcome is not going to be a result of how you've lined them up is insanity. Is literal insanity. Right? We don't want to deal with the reality that the miscreants aren't the only people who need help. The miscreants aren't the only people who need therapy. If you're black in America, if you are a descendant of chattel slavery, you are wounded. We all need therapy, including the people who are raising these people, including your grandmama and your mama and your auntie and your uncle and your father. Right? So many of the practices that we have as a people, so many of the ways of being that we have as a people, so many of the standards that we have set as a people are a direct result of that past in history. And because they're a direct result of that past in history, they're not healthy. They're survival tactics. There were things we had to do out of a sense of survival. It wasn't the healthiest thing to do. It wasn't the thing that made the most sense. It was what had to happen so that we could get by. And a lot of that we haven't released, right? We got our freedom physically, but we are very much so still emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually in bondage. That bondage has been passed down from generation to generation, and it continues to thrive. And that's part of the reason why these things are what they are. Part of the reason, not the reason in its entirety. Right? And so when it's time to talk about healing, it's everybody. It's not just your bad seed. Right? Again, we want to dance on the top layer. We want to focus on the education and the jobs and it's just like there are people all over the world, right? 256 countries in the world. There are people all over the world who don't have educations, who don't have jobs. And yet, you don't see them murdering each other. You don't see the same outcomes. How do you explain that? How do you explain that? American poverty is the most privileged poverty to live in. People give their lives to get over here to live in American poverty. And so this notion that education and employment is going to save us is naive. It's naive. That doesn't change the mind, the heart, and the spirit. It doesn't change that. That's material. And so it's just like recognizing that there's spiritual work that needs to be done is another really, really, really important part of solving this problem that I never see mentioned. I never see mentioned. And even when, like, the religious community comes forward, which I think is really interesting, right? I never see that aspect talked about, right? We need soul surgery. We need soul surgery. We need open heart surgery. Our souls were destroyed through that history and through that experience. And then to take it a step further, I'm going to go a little deeper into the spiritual component. Like, why is it, you got to ask yourself, why is it that certain places, I'm talking about like geographic locations, see this problem in ways and on a scale that others don't? Right? Why is it that, Philadelphia has this issue in the way that they do? Right? Well, what is Philadelphia? Philadelphia is the founding place of this country. Right? It was the capital before DC. And what happened in Philadelphia? Well, it's the birthplace. It's where the country was established. It's where the Constitution was signed, right? And what is in the Constitution? What does the Constitution say about black people? The Constitution says that black people are not whole. The Constitution says that black people are 3/5 of a person. The Constitution says that black people aren't deserving of, things that everyone else is. Now, I'm going to get a little deeper into spirituality, and this may turn people off or, spook people out. And it is what it is at this point, right? If we want to solve this problem, we got to get real. We got to get real, right? If politics and laws were going to do it, it would have happened already. We've had that since the founding of this country. And so you have to recognize that words cast spells, right? And it doesn't matter what format the words are in, whether written or spoken. You put a group of words together, you're spell casting. And I know that might be something that's like out there and woo woo for people and difficult for people to like accept, understand, tap into, but it's the reality of it. And it's a really important part of the reality, right? That document was signed, it was set into stone right there in that city, right? So that's a covenant, that's an oath. When you take words and you put them out into the ether and then you sign on that, that's covenant, that's oath, and it's spell casting to a degree, right? You don't need all of the spooky um elements that people talk about on TV that you hear about. I mean, that stuff can be included, but in its most basic form, it's words. Word is bond, right? That's what that means. And so you had a covenant that was formed right there in that city about a group of people, and that yoke has not been broken. That yoke has not been broken. That yoke, that covenant, that oath is still in place, right? We still walk around abiding by that. That's the mentality of most people. They don't see themselves as worthy. They don't see themselves as whole people. They don't see themselves as deserving. They don't have any sanctity for other people's lives because they don't have any sanctity for their own. And part of that is not just us. Part of that is what I just explained. Now, to take it a little deeper, right? We going to do some history, research, and learning today. The people who signed that document, the founding fathers of this country, who were they? They weren't God-fearing Christians. They weren't devout Muslims. They were deists. What are deists? What do deists believe? I'm not going to tell you because I think that we are at a point in history where it's time for us to take the steps to develop wisdom. And in order to do that, right, you got to go and seek out the information for yourself. So they were deists, right? Not only were they deists, but they were something else. I'm not going to say what that something else was. Drop down and get your Google on. Go and see who majority of the founding fathers, what did they belong to? What group were they a part of? And what did that group believe in? And what did that group practice? And then you'll understand, because it explains a lot. It explains a lot about the city of Philadelphia and why things are what they are. It also explains a lot about this country as a whole and why this country is what it is because of what it was founded on, because it was at its foundation. If your foundation is rotten, your fruit is rotten. Right? So there's absolutely, positively a negative, and I'm going to just call it what it is, as a demonic stronghold on the city of Philadelphia for that reason, right? That has carried over hundreds of years since 1776 when that document was signed. And in order to break that, right, in order to come out of that covenant, that's spiritual. There's spiritual work that has to be done. You can't solve a spiritual problem with physical solutions. And I think that it's very obvious at this point that that's what we're dealing with. When you've dealt with a problem in the physical, right? And you've done everything that you can possibly do in the physical and nothing's changing, that's your indication that you're dealing with something spiritual. That's your indication that you have to go into the spiritual to shift things. And so, again, there's spiritual work that has to be done by us as a people in order to come out of these covenants, in order to break these oaths, in order to free our bloodlines, right? Bloodline curses are real. Bloodline curses are absolutely positively real. And I know because there's one on my bloodline that I'm fighting myself, right? And I'll actually share it just to give more context, because this idea that like it's all about education and jobs is so not the complete answer, right? I lived my life completely differently than my parents did. I made all the right decisions by society standard, right? I checked off all the boxes. I got the education. I didn't start a family before I was ready to do it. I didn't get involved in things that would be considered to be negative. And still, I found myself, right, in the same trouble, in the same kind of up against the same problems, really, that both of my parents had at the exact same age. How do you explain that? How do you explain the reality that I took completely different steps, right? That I did all the right things, and still I have the same obstacles and challenges that they had at the exact same age, right? Bloodline issues, strongholds within the bloodline around poverty, around finances, around mental health, around just prosperity in general. And so, again, right? Spiritual problem that requires spiritual solutions. And so, like, until we're ready to deal with these things in these ways, we're not going to have anything different. Until we're ready to, like, face the music around truths that are extremely uncomfortable, we're not going to have anything different. We got to deal with the fact that most of the time, those of us who are trying to choose a different path, those of us who are trying to do the right thing, those of us who are trying to heal aren't even supported by our families when we try to do that. When we try to step outside of the pattern that has been established, I'm speaking from experience, I'm talking about my own life here. We're labeled as problematic. You think you're better. You know, you don't value us, right? You are a problem within this group because you're not doing what everybody else in the group is doing. When you start bringing the truths to the table, which I already kind of spoke to and shared, oof, I'm shiny. When you start bringing the truth to the table, right, about how problems are top down, and so your leadership sets the stage and creates the culture and decides what exists and what doesn't exist, right? When you start talking about how the elders are toxic, how the elders haven't dealt with their own trauma, and so they're perpetuating that trauma on the next generation, thereby creating a toxic next generation that would fall into certain problems like addiction and, the street and everything else. You are looked at as pariah. We got to deal with that. We got to own that. Whole families have to come together and go to therapy. Not just one person. Whole families, everybody. If there's